everybody. Today we'll be talking about a contrastive analysis of the Russian and English languages by Alyssa Francis,
Alessandra Lyman,
and Juliana Steppas.
So to begin, we'll talk a little bit about the origin of Russian and the history of the Russian language. So Russian began to form around 3500 to 2500 BC, when the people who spoke Indo-European began to form dialect communities separate from each other. As the Indo-European tribes migrated to the west and the east, the Slavic tribes separated and developed a language called Common Slavonic, or Proto-Slavonic. Therefore, Russians belong to the Slavonic branch of the Indo-European family of languages. The Common Slavonic speakers were further separated to the west, eastern, and southern groups. The Eastern Slavs found their home in present-day Ukraine. Although the date is unknown, sometime between the separation of Slavs, the Eastern Slavic or Old Russian language was further divided into three major dialect groups. Today, these groups are known as Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Russian. As a result of the shared history between these countries, Russian most closely relates to Ukrainian and Belarusian. Other Slavic languages have overlap as well, such as Polish, Czech, Slovak, Slovene, Serbian, Croatian, Bulgarian, and Macedonian. Early writing discoveries of Russian text were Old Russian and Old Church Slavonic, dating back to the 10th century. Some other languages found on these same artifacts included Finnish, Latin, and Greek. These items were found at Novgorod and contained early versions of the Cyrillic alphabet. Russian started to appear regularly during the reign of Peter the Great. Peter the Great introduced a revised alphabet and encouraged its use due to the close resemblance to the spoken language. The dialect of Moscow was used as the foundation of the written Russian language. The development of the writing system is marked by four important events. First, the birth of the Cyrillic alphabet in 862 AD. The second, Southern Slavic influence, which was a set of 13th century reforms. Peter the Great's reform of the 18th century. And finally, the communist reforms of 1917. 862 AD marks the first attempt at a writing system when Thessalonian monks were instructed by the Byzantine emperor to bring the gospel to the Slavic people. The monks Cyril and Methodius created an alphabet based on the phonemic properties of the dialect of Slavonic spoken in Macedonia. Most scholars agree this writing system is the Glagolitic alphabet, a complex system. The origin of the Cyrillic system, a more simple alphabet based on the orthography of Greek, Hebrew, and Coptic, is less known. Some believe it was created by Cyril, while others believe it was created after the death of Cyril and Methodius. Either way, much of the Cyrillic alphabet serves as the orthographic base for Russian and multiple other languages, including Ukrainian, Bulgarian, and Mongolian. Throughout history, several revisions have taken place to the written language due to the tension between the written and spoken languages. In 2001, it was reported that 148 million people in Russia speak Russian as their primary language. Reports also suggest that around 80 million people in the former Republic of the Soviet Union primarily speak Russian, and 40 million people in the now independent countries report Russian as their second language. Linguists divide dialects into three categories: Northern, Central, and Southern. The Russian that is most commonly referenced is the Central or Moscow dialect. Northern Russian, as you might be able to guess by the name, is spoken north of Moscow, while Southern Russian is spoken south of Moscow. In the 20th century, the education system of the Soviet government standardized Russian. So there's not a vast difference, but and TV and radio also influenced the standardization of Russian.
So for an overview of general features, in phonology, due to the differences in phonological systems, it's relatively difficult for Russian speakers to develop or acquire native speaker-like standards for pronunciation and intonation. For morphology, Derivational morphology is creating words by prefixation and suffixation. The Russian language has a set of prefixes, suffixes, and infixes that can be applied to words to alter meaning. In Russian, a compound prefix and suffix are allowed. Prefixation occurs in Russian verbs, adjectives, adverbs, and nouns. Word meaning can change completely without the addition of an affix. For syntax, flexible word order is used. Verb position can change the style of what is being said. Verb starts a sentence if a speaker wants to communicate past events, and verbs are placed at the end of sentences for many questions for emphasizing an action. Most commonly, verbs are in the center. Multiple negatives are used in Russian, which can make it very complicated in terms of understanding a sentence. So general order of words is typically subject, verb, object, and the information that the speaker wants to emphasize usually is placed at the end. So the same sentence could be written many different ways. For example, yesterday my son scored a goal in a soccer game. The emphasis is on the soccer game. My son scored a goal in a soccer game yesterday. Yesterday is what's being emphasized. And in terms of the use of multiple negatives, an example that's used is no one, never, to no one, nothing, does not forgive. This is meaning no one ever forgives anyone for anything, which is very confusing to an English speaker, but sounds completely normal in Russian. So more specifically related to phonological differences in Russian and English. In Russian, there's 5 vowel sounds with no differentiation compared to English, where there's 12 vowel sounds with 5 long, 7 short. In Russian, there's an absence of diphthongs, where in English there's 8. In Russian, it's a mainly phonetic language, whereas English is less phonetic. And in terms of similarities, there are similar numbers of consonants, and there are variable stress patterns in both languages. However, in Russian, there's 4 sounds that are missing in English, including the W, both the sounds, and ng at the end of words like driving. In English, there's a lot of difference in the spelling and pronunciation of words, in part because of borrowed words and because English has changed and evolved over time and has included pieces of Old English, Middle English, and now incorporated modern English. And although these changes have taken place, the spelling hasn't changed accordingly. For morphology, Russian is a multi-syllabic language where English prefers the use of 1-syllable words, and in Russian it could be up to 8 syllables in a word. There's multiple affixes that can be added to words to make different meanings, where in English there's affixes are added most commonly to verbs. In Russian, affixes are most commonly added to verbs of motion, but can be added to nouns, adjectives, and adverbs. And there's a set of prefixes, suffixes, and infixes in Russian that can be used to produce multiple derivatives of a word. In English language, there's the use of prefixes, suffixes, and affixes. Prefixes do not typically alter the word class of the base word. In an example, you'd use visit and revisit. So the word hasn't actually changed, it's just the action that's being done. Suffixes typically do not alter the word class in English. So a good example is Russian names. They consist of 3 parts. First is your given name, second is the patronymic name, which is a modified version of the father's name, and lastly, the family name. The first name corresponds to English as our first name would be. The patronymic is the father's name followed by a suffix, which would be ich, ivich, evich in males, or avna, evna, and ichna in females. The family name is the last name, and usually these are derivatives of ordinary words, like a primary name, and suffixes of the family names are different for males and females. So for males, it ends with av, ev, in, I. And females, it ends with avna, ova, eva, ina, I, and I. The suffixes express belonging to, so this is the wife belonging to Frank. And in English, prefix like visit and revisit, like I mentioned before, doesn't change much when you use it, whereas when you use suffixes that alter words would be like dark to darkness, where it goes from a noun to an adjective. So for syntax, in Russian, verb tense is based on the concept of aspect, and there are a few auxiliary verbs. There's a lack of copula, There's no articles, so a lot of errors that we see are in article use. And an example of that could be there was snow day or there was not sound on the street. So a lot of times there's just a lack of using those words because they don't have them in Russian. In English, there's also variable stress patterns. There's progressive and perfect tense forms, and it avoids the need for affixation or inflection with extensive use of auxiliaries. And there's a modal verb system that's more complex, as well as a complex article system, which is why it would be very hard to move from a system where you have no articles to English, which has a lot of articles that are used. In Russian, there's a complex system of noun and adjective declensions and verb conjugations, but no fixed word order. And there's 3 tenses, the past, the present, and the future. Whereas in English, it's a really analytic language. Grammatical meaning is largely expressed through additional words and changing word order. And so moving the words makes for a completely different sentence. There's a perfect and progressive forms of verbs. And in terms of aspect, actions are either completed or not completed by appending affixes to the verb stem, which is a contrast between actions that are uncompleted, imperfect aspect, and those that have been completed, which is perfect aspect. Also in Russian, you have cases, and you have prepositions in English that mark adverbial functions, such as time, manner, and the means of carrying out an action. So for semantics and pragmatics, to start with semantics, Russian semantics, there's 3 genders for nouns. So you're either masculine, you have feminine, or you have neutral words. Then word order is flexible, as it was previously stated. Whereas in English, we have nouns that are not gendered, and word order is inflexible. When you change word order, you change meaning. Then for Russian, cases are used to determine what a noun does in a sentence, and 6 cases, which are denoted by suffixes, are used. English cannot change the word order of a sentence, as I have mentioned before. Word order change can make something even incomprehensible in English, which would be something we might see in a Russian speaker, would be that they make a sentence that grammatically makes no sense because of the way that they've placed words. And in terms of pragmatics, just as a preview, this will be something covered later on the slides related to implications for English language teaching learners. And they use the most extreme descriptors. So in cases like where you'd be wishing someone warm wishes, or we'd say something, you have a request for something, they actually use the word hot instead of warm. And any other example of this would be a time where you're trying to convey emotion, and anytime that you have an interpersonal relationship with someone, you want to make sure that you're including these really strong words to express emotion.
So now I'm going to move into some implications for classroom teachers as to why it's important to know the distinctions and differences between Russian and English languages. So as we mentioned previously, Russian is the primary language for a large population of people. It's a primary language in countries including Russia, Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan. And it's also the secondary language in many other countries, many of which were part of the former Soviet Union. And then there are also notable contingencies of Russian speakers in Cyprus, Finland, Hungary, Mongolia, Poland, China, the US, and Israel. So this prevalence is why it's important for teachers of English learners to be aware of the differences in Russian and English. Russian is the 8th most spoken language in the world, and it makes up about 2.3% of the world's population are Russian native speakers. So that's approximately 166 million native speakers. And of those, 900,000 Russian speakers live in the United States out of a population of just about 300 million. And then additionally, Russian has become the second most used language online. It makes up about 6% of all websites. Some other difficulties that Russian speakers may have as they learn English would be overemphasis on words that would be swallowed by native English speakers. So if I say the sentence, he has two brothers, I don't put as much emphasis on the word has as a Russian native speaker would put. Someone who speaks Russian natively would probably pronounce that sentence as he has two brothers, where the most emphasis is put on the word has, whereas an English native speaker doesn't put quite as much. There's also that difference in intonation that I've mentioned previously, but this, because Russian speakers tend to speak English in sort of this monotone way, it might be difficult to differentiate between when a student is asking a question or making a statement. So in English, we raise our voice at the end of a question to signal that it is a question, and that does not occur in Russian, so Russian native speakers may not do that as they learn English. There's also a tendency for Russian native speakers to leave out auxiliary verbs in both questions and negatives. So instead of saying, how did he do that, or I do not have one, a Russian native speaker may say, how he do that, I no have one. Because there are no auxiliary verbs in Russian, this is kind of a transfer of that language onto English. Again, the English rhythm and stress patterns can be difficult for native Russian speakers. And then there's also a difference in countable distinctions. So a Russian speaker may say, her hairs are nice, or I'll give you a good advice. So where I would say her hair is nice, and that includes all of the hairs on her head, the Russian speakers would still make that plural. And then also, because Russian nouns are gendered, students may continue to assign gender as they learn English. So if you ask a student, where did you put the book? They may respond with, I put her on the table, because the Russian word for book is female. They assign the female pronoun. Russian native speakers, as Juliana also mentioned, tend to use the most extreme descriptor when they're referring to someone that they care about or think favorably of. So if they were to say warm wishes to someone, they may actually say hot wishes, because warm wouldn't adequately convey how they feel. So you put hot because it's the most extreme and the most sort of like caring. As far as classroom implications and cultural aspects that teachers need to be aware of before working with Russian native speakers, it's important to be aware of family structures, importance of education, and conversational aspects in Russian culture. So first, the family is a very important part of Russian culture. It's not uncommon for people in Russia to live with extended family. So be aware that if students move from Russia to America, this may also be the case. They may live with extended family like the grandparents and aunts and uncles. It's also important that teachers recognize whether or not students are from Russia or from a different country that speaks Russian as a first language. Some of these countries have very patriarchal views, and it's important to be mindful of this when addressing parents. You don't want to insult parents by maybe addressing the woman instead of the man, and causing some sort of conflict between the family and the school. In Russia, education is held with high regard. It has one of the highest educational levels in the world, with more than 40% of its people educated at the college or university level. So this is important to be mindful in that parents may take a special interest in their children's education. And then Russian speakers or people from Russia favor being close during conversation, while Americans sort of prefer to be further apart. To a Russian, it may be seen as an insult for someone to back away from them during a conversation. So teachers need to be mindful of this in that they don't want to back away from a parent who's just trying to engage in a conversation. Just be aware that there are different preferences in personal space, and just be mindful that they're not trying to encroach on personal space, it's just a cultural difference. And then also, because of the intonation differences that we've mentioned throughout the presentation, it may be difficult to determine whether or not an individual is asking a question or making a statement. It's important not to interpret statements or questions made as statements as harsh or rude. Just be mindful of what is being said and whether or not it's a question or a statement from a parent. So that concludes our presentation. We hope to have provided some insight as to how to address specific needs of Russian native speakers as they learn English. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me or any of my group members. And thank you for watching.